Hello, everyone. My name is Spencer Cox, and I'm going to talk to you guys about uh, GIS and how you can use it to innovate your own company and firm and just kind of what it is in general. So let's start with the basics. Here's our agenda. We're going to be talking about what GIS is, how it's used, why you should use it, how it's been used in COVID, and then some ethical concerns that come along with using it. Before we get into the GIS stuff and kind of defining that and parsing that apart, let's start by talking about geography in general. GIS is heavily influenced by geography, and I feel like there's some kind of misconceptions about what geography is. It's not just understanding the physical land layout, understanding how mountain peaks and glaciers and canyons are formed. And conversely, it's not about knowing the capitals of every country in the world. Instead, what we'll find is it's about understanding the place where you want to study and how everything around it influences it. So it's this idea of taking, in-depth statistics and using those to understand the science of place. And we'll get into a bunch of examples of that in a second here. The first and most important slide, I think, is talking about what it is. So geographic, we kind of just define there, and then information systems is what we've been defining this entire class. So basically, it's this framework for gathering, managing, analyzing data. Then I would add on, it's also communicating it. So sharing it in a way that is easily understood by the entire world. And then, like we said, it analyzes spatial location, which is a fancy word for place, and then organizes these layers, which we'll talk about in a second more, into visualizations that are maps. So let's look at this bad boy right here. We see our place is clearly outlined. This is Jefferson County, and that's Louisville, Kentucky, if you don't know. And we're looking at two different things to try and make a correlation there. So we're making median income and college graduation. We can go down here to the legend and see that median income goes from yellow, green to dark blue, from lowest to highest. And then, college graduation or college graduates in the area goes from a very small dot to a significantly larger dot in red. So we can draw a couple conclusions from this, but you can say generally the higher the median income, the more likely that there are more college graduates there. That's not always the case though. And this is not a perfect map, but we can draw a lot more conclusions from this than we can from this. And that's really the value of GIS. So what can you use it for? I feel like a lot of people say, well, that's all nice and good, but I don't need to know about stuff like that for my work. Well, let's look, healthcare uses it to find, how public health outcomes are influenced by where you live. So let's take the instance of Parkersburg, Virginia, or West Virginia. We see there that there was a super high per capita percentage of people that had cancer. And they said, well, why was that? That's so weird that such a small town would have such a high cancer rate. And what they found out is that there was actually pollution in their water from a local polluting company. And so they were able to correct that over time. Well, let's talk about economic. Like retail firms can use it all the time. When my dad worked at Macy's, I frequently talked with their GIS department about how they used it. And, they would use it for things like, but not, they would use it for things like trying to find out where to put a new store. They would look at the median income of the area. They would look at the employment rate. They would look at this and that. And turns out a lot of this information is taken up by our government. It's either taken up through the census or the EPA or USDA. There are so many ways that our government and these companies can get our information. Every time we log on to their website, not only are we geotagged, which means our location is saved in their website, but they're also getting the information that we bought. So we can say, well, it seems like everyone in this area is buying this specific beverage. So let's start really heavily marketing there to try and build up a stronger following. And so that's kind of just even more of the value. So obviously there's agriculture, looking at soil types, when to plant things, environmental is kind of what I've done, and I do watershed planning for Mill Creek Alliance. As we look over here, we're going to kind of tell you a story. And these three maps are going to tell you kind of the three different ways that GIS is used. So it's kind of, one of them is kind of this overarching way. We can see that there's major air polluting facilities all throughout the United States. We can see that there are these non-attainment zones, which basically means that they don't meet the federal regulations for safety. And then down here, we see this is Chicago. And, there are a lot of air polluting facilities in there. What about this map? What is it trying to tell us? Well, it's confusing. It has the hospitalizations due to asthma, small, 10 or under, 50 or under, and 100 or under. And then it has number of air polluting facilities. But when you look at it, you say there doesn't seem to be that strong of a correlation. And that's still valuable. We now know that number of air polluting facilities probably doesn't relate to the hospitalizations due to asthma. So what does? Well, median income seems to correlate much stronger. We can say that these areas that generally have a lower median income tend to have higher percentage of people with asthma in them. So look at this map. Kind of confusing just looking at it. You say there's a lot of bits and pieces, there are a lot of colors, bizarre. The value of GIS is being able to communicate the information what you want your constituents to know in a very little amount of time. So let's look at it again. We can see that it's a plot of land, don't really know where, don't really know when, not super important. What we can see is that the rivers are outlined and labeled, so they're probably important. And then we can see that there's these two impairment zones, and those are totally different than all the other colors. So those are probably important too. And then we can look around and say, well, what's around those impairment zones? Mostly this brown and this yellow here. Go down to legend, pasture and hay. We don't know what these impaired zones do. We don't know why they're there, but they're around these rivers, and the rivers are mostly surrounded by pasture and hay. And turns out that's about all you need to know about this map. It's trying to talk about non-point source pollution and how, things like pesticides and herbicides can leak into rivers. But just from this basic knowledge of understanding how to read maps, we were able to get that far. So it creates these correlations, but doesn't always mean that they're causations. To do that, we have to use geostatistics, which is the numbers behind all of this, because there's a mini Excel sheets behind all of these data outputs that are maps. But it also promotes understanding, especially for visual learners. So GIS is kind of waking the world up to the power of geography, the science of integration, and has the framework for creating a better future. And that's by Jack Dangerman. And then this is just another quote that I thought was interesting was, GIS is a form of digital mapping technology, kind of like Google Earth, but better. And I would absolutely agree with that. That's probably the easiest way to explain it. But we have seen GIS used extensively in the COVID outbreak. From more recently tracking, vaccine, this amount of population that's received the vaccine, to, let's see, let's pull it up. This map that I at least followed exclusively or extensively at the beginning of the virus that kind of talked about total cases, and this is all powered by geostatistical processes. What about ethical concerns? Well, there are kind of a lot. Let's start at the top. So there's LiDAR, which is a satellite system that long time ago wasn't very accurate. It could only see up to 10 or 30 meters. So it couldn't really make out a big distinction. but now it can go up to 0.03 meters. So that means it can get really, really, really fine images of what's going on Earth. And so everything as the Earth rotates is being taken pictures of constantly. Every time you use an app, every time you buy something, that purchase is geotagged. And websites and companies can see that. So that's kind of just a privacy concern as far as companies and governments and everything are getting pictures and where you are and what you're doing. We've talked about that a lot. The other thing I want to talk about is how data can be stored on servers and accessed or stolen by governments. And then the last ethical thing I want to talk about has to do with discrimination. And without going too into it, this is another map that one of my professors at University of Louisville worked on, which talks about how the maps created by banks for loans in the early 20th century still impact poverty today. So these regions that were ranked lower, which means they couldn't get loans for houses, are still the most impoverished areas of Louisville today. Just kind of how mapping can have long-lasting impacts on health and prosperity. So let's go into some questions. Do you or your firm use GIS? If so, what for? If not, after seeing this presentation, do you think, or can you think of anything to use it for besides work? Where have you encountered GIS in your own life? How was your experience? Does the benefit of this do the benefits of this information outweigh the cost of privacy and security of geographical data? If you could conduct one study using GIS, what would you research and why? I want to thank you all for watching my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the discussion posts, and I'm excited to hear you guys start talking. All right. Thank you guys.